Hi there, this is a video about the game Guderian's Blitzkrieg and my experience with it. I had the OCS game DAC 2 many years ago, and I'd read the rules. I hadn't punched it out, and I sold it as a means of part funding my move to Italy, where I am now. That was 10 years ago. Ever since then, I've been, wanting to get into OCS. It's a popular system, and so I was just sort of trying to find my entry, and I noticed a cheap copy of Guderian's Blitzkrieg going for sale. Now I know that it's not. The rules for OCS have changed somewhat since this game was produced, the first in the series. Some people call this the godfather or the grandfather of OCS, or the stepfather. The main changes, as far as I can tell, so I've downloaded the current rules of the OCS system. The main changes, as far as I can tell, apart from the fact that in Guderian's Blitzkrieg, each turn is so it's 7 days. Each turn is a week, and you have 2 player turns in each turn. The first player, second player, first player, second player. And you have the over phase, which includes weather, supply, reinforcements, and the initiative before those. So you have 2 player turns. Before you check, you spend supply and bring on reinforcements. In OCS as it currently is, you have 1 player turn, and then you do supply and reinforcements and so forth. There's that difference, and then apart from the air rules are different, I don't really mind about that. Here's air units that are in action at the moment. But in fact it's come to a standstill because in the game I'm playing, I'm on turn 7 of a 13 turn campaign game, and we've got heavy rain and air condition of soup. In soup, they can fly close in the same hex as their air base. That's about it. They can hardly see anything. And the air, it's quite abstract in this, and I wouldn't mind if it wasn't there, because it's playing a solo game. It's just a bit of an extra headache. It's been useful for sort of for bombardments and so forth, but I haven't really used it very effectively for things like breaking railway lines and supply lines and stuff like that. And I was kind of getting used to it, and then we got the soup result, and I think it's going to be pretty much soupy in the air for the rest of this game. The skies are unlikely to clear drastically, so it doesn't have a huge effect on this game, at least the way I've been playing it. So the air rules is something which is a bit different. I don't mind these. They have been made better apparently. But then the major difference is in terms of supply. Now on here, all supply is on the map. So these are supply dumps. 1T is 4T supply is equal to 1 of these, so it's like a quarter, if you will. So the Russian, there you see they've got a bit of a stack of supply there. The Russians have plentiful supply, especially because they haven't launched offensives. You do spend supply on defence, but the Russians have been sort of trying to conserve themselves up to this point. So in OCS as it is now, you have generally trace supply, which means you'll trace back from your units to a certain hex or the board edge, and if they can trace back to that, then they are in supply. And then there's some on-map supply. I think it's for combat supply, but general in or out of supply ness is trace supply in current OCS. In this, all supply is tracked on map. So that's a big difference, and I understand that it was preferred that way, although in the design rules for this, Dean Essig, I understood he wanted the supply on the map. He didn't want to do a trace supply system, which every other war game with supply generally does. It's very rare to have it on map. He wanted that sense of having supply dumps to protect. So he kind of made a compromise in the OCS as it currently is, according to my understanding. So I'm going with this game. You have his original idea. I guess it wasn't so well liked because it's. I'm not going to say it's laborious, but you do have to, you have to sort of track it out. But for example, the Germans, they gain supply either at Konotop here or Smolensk here. So it piles up there at the supply point after every 2-player turns. So in the current OCS, it would be really onerous if you had to do that here and here. So their supply builds up, and then they have to truck it. Germans have wagons, which are not so great. They don't move so fast, and then also trucks, and so the trucks have to come back, pick up the supply, and go out. You can do what's called I've forgotten the term because this has been on hold. I played this before I went to Berlin almost a month ago, and I haven't been able to get back to it. Well, I haven't got back to it because it's it's a bit of a monster. I was kind of building myself up to it. You can essentially work out that loading up cost and movement points, the movement points to get to a certain point, and the unloading cost, and you just leave your truck unit there, and that's this kind of distance you can go there, load up, move back, unload, and do that all in one turn. So that's his kind of back and forth movement of supply. So you can sort of track the supply like that. You don't have to every time count movement points. You just put your truck unit there, and or 10 truck points there, and you say, okay, I know that every turn I can get 10 supply points there. Then you would put another set there, and then they would ferry that to there, pick that up. So you can chain it up like that in the next to do it. But it does, you do have to look out for it. But it's very, I like it because you are so conscious of those supply lines. With trace supply, say you've got these German units here, with trace supply that the Soviets would be able to say move around here, and they'd have to sit here and block the supply, the tracing of the supply back to Konotop or wherever it is. So they physically have to sit there, for a turn to block that all the time. But in this, it creates a very different flavour because the Germans have supply piled up here. So the Soviets in one turn, they could go here, and they could capture those supply dumps. They might take some. They might be able to take some themselves. Some might be destroyed. The Germans have the option to destroy some if they get them in time. But anyway, the point being that they could go there, destroy that supply dump, and then move back or go somewhere else. And the Germans are still out of supply. The Soviets don't have to kind of sit behind them blocking that trace supply route. You can argue both ways, I think, which ones represents the reality of the situation better. But for me, this creates a very exciting thing which you don't normally get in war games of looking to take out supply dumps and having to have significant rear reserve forces to protect those supply dumps. Not the usual, just trying to create a massive screen just to protect your general rear area so that every unit can trace. The trace does come in because the supply's there, but then it has to get to the units that are about to go into combat. And the way that works is that the headquarters units can trace a certain distance back to the supply, and then they can throw it out to units a certain supply. So if those Soviet units, say, did sit here, although they wouldn't have captured that supply dump, that headquarters could not throw it forwards to those units to be in supply. So you do still have that sort of effect, but there's just this extra factor added in, which makes the game very exciting. So I'm enjoying it immensely. All Dean Essig's games that I've played, I've enjoyed. I think he designs very good systems and very clear rule books. What is the situation? Well, so this is the maybe a bit of the sort of the central, but essentially the southern pinch of movement of Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow. So Moscow is actually represented over there, and as I said, I haven't played this for a while, so I forget. But yeah, that's right. There is actually a Stalin counter. If the Germans occupy, I think it's 5 hexes of Moscow and or kill Stalin and hold it for a whole week, then they have automatically won the game. But you can see coming out from Moscow, these are entrenchments. So there's a ring entrenchments immediately around Moscow. Then there's another ring here. These are replacement units coming out to go up to the front. The blacks are major roads, and then there's railways along them and secondary roads. And then you can see there's another defensive line here. So to get through that, the Germans have got a big task. And you can see these are also fortifications that are built as and when and where you like. So you can see the Soviets are reinforcing that line because the Germans have advanced this far. Let me just take you quickly around the map a minute. So here's Orel, there's Voronezh, and here is the famous Kursk. It's just one little hex on this map, but that is the Kursk we know of. So you can see it's how far it is from Moscow, but also how close it is, which tells you something about the scale of this campaign as represented on this map. There's Bryansk, and here we have something called Vyazma. Now, these are victory points. The Germans win. If they get 20 victory points, they have a minor victory. And then it's something like 40 or 30 for substantial, and then 40, I guess, for a major victory. Yes, here it is. 40 or more for major. So that is if they don't have the automatic victory, sudden death victory for taking Moscow and or Stalin. The Soviets win if the Germans only amass less than 20 victory points. Now, the Germans are the ones amassing victory points because they want to take these cities. So they effectively have got Vyazma. So that has held out for a long time. You can see, if I pan back, the German front is like this. So as we're on turn 7 of 13, so we're halfway through the game. Although now with the bad weather coming, and I'll speak about that in a bit, it's going to slow things down tremendously. So that has been a hard slog because the Soviets defended it fiercely. You can see because of this river here, it kind of cut that section off from the rest of what's going on. So it was kind of like a whole separate battle going on there, and the Germans only had infantry for a long time. So without having, also there was swamps that so the Soviets, the start lines here, so that, the Soviets pushed them back, but then it's slow to move around through the swampy and forested areas, and they didn't have the Panzer divisions to send whizzing around. So that has been a long, slow slog, and you can see it's held onto the road, essentially because of the supply, having to bring up the supply physically. You need those roads and or railroads as vital lines. So they got 10 points there, I'm saying 5 here for Spaz Damask. You can see they cleared that nicely and have moved out into this heavy forested area. They also have Bryansk, which gives them 10 points. So that's 25. Nice little thing you get in Bryansk is you get an armoured train. I think it's underneath there, that stack. So it's just a sort of nice little extra colour. It was a Soviet train, but they historically captured in Bryansk. So you see the T means it can transport stuff. and it has a massive 40 movement points. It's unfortunately it's not battle worthy, but it is armoured, so protective. So 25 points, and then for Kursk they get 5 points, so that's 30 points worth. They could take 10 more for Voronezh, 10 more for Orel, and 10 more for Kaluga, and then 15 for Tula. But I don't think they're going to. So this is the point we're at. You can see the Soviets are reinforcing, and you can see how I just love the way it happens in these clusters along the road routes. And to me, and here they spread out because, well, they're closer to Moscow, and also they got all this sort of defensible terrain. Here, this terrain is not defensible. So what you don't get is you don't get a continuous front of a unit every hex or every 2 hexes, which you would get in so many sort of operational games of this scope. Instead, they are concentrated on the supply routes and little isolated areas here. So, if the Germans choose to come along this road, there's put a block there in Livny and some more in Yelets, and so just trying to hold, because that's a vital supply route between Voronezh and Moscow. So if these units need to move back up that way, if they need to withdraw, so forth, or if units need to be sent from Moscow or supply needs to be sent from Moscow. So you can see they're clustered around the road and rail area because that's what they need to defend. If the Germans went off up here, that would be fine. They could sit there, but they'd be easily out of supply because there's not the network. So they cling to the roads, and I really like this aspect of it. So there's the ability to move around and manoeuvre, but you're going to have to sort of justify it and make sure that you don't end up just sort of cut off out of supply. And you really do guard these the road and rail routes. So the Germans have 30 victory points, but they lose victory points for their best units, 1 per, and they've lost 5 of those. Here is the casualties part. You can see mostly Russian, but the Germans have lost 5 of those. So they've actually got 25 victory points, which at the moment is a minor victory. If the Soviets take 6 victory points off them, so kill 6 of those miners, or say recapture Kursk or one of these, then the Soviets will gain a minor victory. And this is the point we're at. So Germans, essentially their reinforcements are slow they get those, that's it. You can see the Soviets are still getting reinforcements every turn, and here's the list. That's their reinforcements next turn, so they're getting significant reinforcements, so they are building up in strength. And we have hit the Raputitsa. So because we moved from light rain to heavy rain, mud essentially affects. Now mud effects are terrible. Essentially you can only move 5 movement points maximum, and the range for headquarters drawing supply from the dumps and then throwing it forward to the other units is drastically reduced as well. So all operations again are gonna, the range of them is going to shrink, and they're going to be even more closely tied to these roads. In fact, that is why, because on the roads you have obviously greater movement point potential for throwing the supply forwards, whereas through this, the sort of wilderness or, well, countryside areas, supply moves much more slowly and wouldn't get very far. So yeah, that's also why we've stuck to we're sort of shrinking to the road areas. The Germans are quite well spread out here, but you can see they have no, actually that's a defensive line. No, that's a setup line. But anyway, they went for a daring move, and the Soviets have reinforced it. So these essentially are going to have to, I think, retreat back. That road goes nowhere, and the headquarters probably can't supply them from there, or maybe that is the limit of it, so they could stay there but not launch an attack. This is an air base. Got air bases marked. These ones are air bases that have not been supplied, so the Germans will capture them, but they haven't supplied them, so they can't be used. So essentially we've got the Soviets building up to protect their last major cities. The Germans just haven't got far enough to be able to take Moscow. I think they'd have had to breach this line to have a chance to, you know, slog through these rivers and all this terrain and the further Moscow defences to take that in the game. So essentially, as the German side, they have said, right, this is as far as we get this campaign. We're going to hold hold our positions here and settle for that. Unless an opportunity presents itself, they'd like to take Orel or they'd like to take Voronezh. But to do that within the Raputitsa weather, this mud weather, changing front is going to be so slow. You can see they've got more forces here than over here. But this is being more heavily built up and defended. You have to spend supply to build these fortifications. So, you know, the Russians have made a careful decision. They got them there. So even if the Germans did take Orel, the Russians will be behind the river here, more fortifications. They would have a good chance to take it back again, particularly as we can see all the reinforcements they will be getting, which the Germans won't. So the Germans are at their high tide mark. If, however, they see an opportunity, they will take one of these two, or even this one, and try and hold it. But essentially they can't do that if they can't do anything costly, because that will give the victory to the Soviets. So the Soviets essentially are building up, and then they will be going on to the offensive for the second part of this game. So I hope that gives you some idea of the excitement of the situation which this game presents, and also a little bit about the details to do with supply and what the OCS, particularly this granddaddy of it, is. Yeah, another thing you can see these railhead markers. So the Germans have some engineers that can convert the railways. The Russians have them too if they manage to capture them back. So they've got a railhead here, which essentially means they've mended that railway, or changed it to their gauge, so they can get supplies all the way from Konotop straight up to there, but they haven't spread it out along these branches. In fact, I should probably mark it, that one's not converted either. Again, it's important for supply, but they only have so many of those, so you can see they have rail up to here, but it doesn't go all the way up to here. It meant this was actually very slow gaining Bryansk, and essentially because of the more open terrain here, and there was a heavy concentration of panzer units here at the beginning, I concentrated a lot of supply on here, but consequently, and changing the railway gauge and so forth, so they could move forwards quickly. I was hoping to go for an encircling movement like that, which meant that these fronts had to go much slower, factoring in A, the supply that I was spending there, and B, the fact that they weren't able to convert the railways as quickly to get the supply up. And just as a final note on the supply, you see you roll for it. So I think the first turn it's fixed, maybe the second or third, but essentially, oh no, here you 1 to 4. So I guess you have some supply at the beginning, yeah, that's right, and then you roll for it, but you can see the difference between 72 and 26 supply. That's a huge difference. So if you're unlucky, you just do not get the supplies you need. Soviets do the same, but you can see their range is smaller, so they're always guaranteed a decent amount of supply. And as time goes on, the Germans get less and less. So it's we've definitely reached the high tide mark here. The only question is, will the Raputitsa put off the Soviet offensive too long, or will they make a lunge which the Germans can then exploit? For example, say they lunge forward here, the Germans could maybe do a master stroke with some of their panzer divisions, cut it off, destroy the attack and take a city. That is essentially where we're standing at the moment. Here are panzer divisions, which are figured on the map, these handy units here. 4th Panzer Division at the top there. The DSC is their divisional size equivalent for stacking purposes. Where's the 4th? There, that's the actual 4th themselves. So you can see that you can break them down. What often happens is that you'll have, say, the panzers might move forward while the motorised infantry chugging along slowly behind, and then you have a recce regiment whizzing out. This is the movement rate, so it's got a higher movement rate. There's also, you have modes, so there's 2 modes essentially, movement and combat mode. This is the movement mode, so you can see the movement rate goes up significantly, but the combat value goes down significantly. So you might have some in one movement mode and some in another, but you can see you can send your recce divisions out quickly and to hit enemy supply dumps, which has happened, or to try and surround enemy units, but that's a risky proposition. Or you can keep them all together in the same hex, waiting for their next operation. So there you go. That's a quick look at Guderian's Blitzkrieg.